Welcome to the Find Your Voice, Change Your Life podcast with psychologist Dr. Doreen Downing. Listen in as Doreen interviews people who felt they didn't have a voice or who suffered extreme speaking anxiety. You'll hear stories about how they struggled to speak up, what they did to find their authentic voice, and the confidence they now feel to speak up and make an impact. If you want to get started right away to find your voice, download Doreen's free 7-step guide to fearless speaking at doreen7steps.com. And now, here is Doreen.
Hi, this is Dr. Doreen Downing, host of the Find Your Voice, Change Your Life podcast. And for those of you who are tuning in today, I get to introduce you to a very special guest of mine. He's one of my mentors. As you know, my approach is much more about being authentic and mindful and coming down into a deeper presence into who you truly are than it is about performance techniques. And I would say that my friend today is somebody who not only believes in it, but does promote mindful life and mindful work. In fact, that's his business. Hi, Jonathan.
Great to be here, Doreen. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and to be heard too. You certainly are that. Well, I'm going to read a bio you sent in so people know what you currently are into. Jonathan Reynolds is a founder and CEO of Mindful Life, Mindful Work Incorporated, a San Francisco-based leadership development company providing services that address the intersection of self-awareness and team performance. Since 1997, Jonathan has trained extensively in the discipline of mindfulness, and his work with leaders and teams emphasizes simple and practical ways to improve performance, efficiency, and workplace cultures by integrating mindfulness I'm going to say that word again, mindful sensibilities. I love that phrase. I've never really heard it as sensibilities, but that seems to be what we're talking about, opening up all of our senses and being sensible at the same time. Lots of meanings for that word, huh?
Yeah, definitely, Doreen.
Yeah. Well, before I dive into the history, because that's where we always like to start, is like you came into this world and you were naturally, available to life and you had your little goo-goo and gagas, but something happened along the way and it's usually environmental. But before I go there, I just want to let people know how I first found you. I live in Marin County and I was looking around for groups that promoted mindfulness. And I found Jonathan, and he was leading a networking group. And networking groups, for me being introverted, I just usually kind of cringe. And I know to put the focus on the other person, but still I have to be able to speak up and introduce or at least promote myself. And that evening, oh my gosh, that evening, Jonathan started with a meditation where we all got quiet and it felt like the community on a deeper level started to gel. And then when we went around to introduce ourselves, I felt my voice was natural. It was connected to my truth, what I really believe in terms of finding your voice and speaking up when you're afraid. And I got a really wonderful client out of that evening. So, Jonathan, that's how I met you.
Wow, what a wonderful beginning.
Yeah, well, what you facilitate in terms of people becoming more aware and, well, this word we started with, sensitive, sensible, seems to be what your gift is. So I'm really glad I get to be your friend and get to meet with you every week as often as I can to do meditation with you.
Wow, well, the feeling is mutual, Doreen. I love getting to know you.
Good, good, good. Well, we're going to get the listeners are going to get to know you today. First, I know it was Midwest where you plopped onto this earth, but if you could begin by just giving us a snapshot of what that family was like, because that's where we first go, hello, world, here I am. What do you think about me? Right?
Yeah, yeah, thanks for the question. I grew up in a small town in northeast Wisconsin, a town of under 10,000 folks. And it was a shipbuilding town, so a lot of working class. My parents were attorneys or in the legal profession, and grew up in a pretty standard nuclear family in the 70s, but in a small town that everything seemed to just be on autopilot. And as a kid, I grew up doing things like fishing and playing baseball and riding bikes and things like this, as small town people do. And there was a lot of spaciousness. There was a lot of nature. There was a lot of just slow time, because there wasn't much going on in a small town in the 70s. And yeah, so, received, of course, familial messages, but also mostly cultural messages around what it was to be a man in the world. And so all of that, of course, came to bear on, setting a foundation, some of which was really positive and some which was not so positive. And I think it's always complex and it's always a blend. But that was the beginning.
All right, folks, already you can hear, how wise he is. And the fact that he just said what's also not so positive and what is possible. And that's what I've learned from Jonathan is the acceptance of what is. And this not so positive is what I think people start why they're here to say, well, how was it not so positive? Because they are struggling and they want to find a way, and they listen to my guests so that they can go, oh yeah, I understand. He came from that, and so did I, or that same kind of struggle. So in terms of your voice in that kind of, it almost sounds idyllic, but I'm sure it wasn't. In
Hmm.
terms of you being able to speak up, have a voice when you were younger, let's say 10, 12, 13, in that kind of age room.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it was from my family, I'm sure in part, but also from the culture at large, and the small town, children were sort of expected to be seen but not heard. They were expected to play but not be in the way. And I think just generally that, of course, sends a message that what you have to say doesn't have value or doesn't have space to be shared. And that has to go somewhere. And so either you find creative outlets, which everybody does, and self-care practices and self-soothing practices, whether deliberately or just intuitively, or they rebel. And so I was the middle of three children, and so I sort of became a little bit of the rebel in the family, because without a space to be me, you have to figure it out. You have to figure out ways. And when you're young, you figure out ways that aren't so skillful. Did a lot of drinking in high school and these sorts of things, which was pretty commonplace in the Midwest and Wisconsin in the 70s, and I'm sure still is 70s and 80s. But you do what you can. Like, we're all on this path and we all try to do our best. Everybody's trying to do their best, even though sometimes getting our needs met is not skillful in the ways that we do it. So yeah, so that was really the beginning, was, seeking freedom. I mean, I think that as a core, sort of value and tenet, freedom, free time, spaciousness in general has been a lifetime practice.
Mhm. Well, it sounds like both the environment felt spacious to you, and however, being kind of couched between an older brother and a younger brother, that didn't feel so spacious. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm, I think that, I mean, everybody has different family dynamics, of course, but whether the parents create a space. I just grew up in a very traditional family where the father was a disciplinarian and the mother was a homemaker. And, I mean, I wouldn't say leave it to Beaver, but there were elements of that for sure, where we just fell into very standard family roles that were predetermined by the 50s.
And when you look back now and you go, ooh, that was the beginning of me beginning to feel I don't fit here.
Hmm.
Where, when did that happen? And any stories about that?
Um, I think that I like to say some of my first meditation experiences were when we get ready for school in the morning. The household was chaotic. And after I was ready to go to school and we were just about to leave out the door, I would say, oh, I need to go up to my room to do one more thing. And I would go up and sit on my bed and close my eyes for about a minute just to give myself a little bit of space and reset to sort of like begin the day from a clear place. And started to do that very intuitively early on because I sort of had a hunger for, whether I was an introvert by nature or what the case may be. I just knew that I needed that to sort of like clear space to move forward, in the best way possible.
That is lovely, imagining that. And the thread, that it's always been there, because when we
Mm.
start our meditation programs, and what I didn't do today though is to say, let's start with the breath at least, a little bit of space. Oh, Jonathan, thank you. That image of you taking that moment before school feels like it's really, really important. I think listeners can say you can take a moment, any moment
Mm,
during a
mhm,
day. So I think that already is giving us some nuggets of wisdom about how to be more present, more mindful, take care of yourself during the day.
mhm.
So another question before I move on to journeying through life. When you went to school, and we're talking about voice, when you went to school in that kind of more traditional setting, yet you were already beginning to feel like you wanted something a little bit different than that particular kind of lifestyle, that kind of living. What was high school
Mhm.
before you actually um, became an adult?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even to roll back a little further, like in grade school, I was a very good student, and there was not a lot of pressure from family. I mean, there was sort of an academic expectation, but not high achievement necessarily. But I loved school. I loved learning, and I was happy to spend a lot of time learning. And I think that in some ways that was a little bit of a distraction from a thwarted emotional life. I was glad to go there and sort of become intellectualized in some ways. And, we all know that that's one way of sort of coping with difficulty is to, overthink it. Uh, so once I recognized, and again, this wasn't deliberate, a lot of this recognition is in retrospect. But once I recognized that wasn't sustainable or that was harming myself in some way, to not know my sort of full embodied person, that's when I sort of started drinking and started partying a lot and doing those sorts of things because I was looking for distraction from an outlet that didn't seem available. And by that I mean um, the the masculine models that I had received were not necessarily very tender or thoughtful or caring in a compassionate, um, feminine way, not female, but actually feminine energetically. And so I thought that that part of myself wasn't going to have space to be integrated, and so I numbed it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's what we do. I just noticed something about this thrill, that it felt like you had a thrill in learning, and
Hmm.
that I would say that that's possibly also how you opened up other worlds for yourself, to see that there was more than this small town life, not that you were trapped in, but that you were existing in, but there was
Hmm.
more. And so that's what I think, what we do when we read.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had never really heard the word even philosophy until I was probably about 20.
Mhm.
And once I found that there was a love of knowledge that was actually a practice, I just became a devourer of materials. I mean, I went at least a year or two where I read almost a book a day, where I was just couldn't get enough. And I designed my whole work life around having reading time, basically. And so that was after I graduated from college, actually.
Mhm. Yeah, but I think that is one of the threads I'm noticing, is that curiosity and that interest in, and it happens that reading is a good way to open those doors to see what else is out there. So what else is out there? Let's go to how you decided to not stay there and start a new life or start a different life.
Yeah, yeah. After I graduated from college, I looked in the mirror and I was feeling pretty depressed. I wasn't, if learning how to drive a car and balance my checkbook was all there was to life, I was going to have a very sad 80 years. And so towards the end of college, I started to ask people the question, who are you? And I asked them to answer in a way that they didn't use normal descriptors like where they were from or their height or their name, but to describe their awareness really, in retrospect. And people were a little bit confused by that question. But for me, that became the central question of who am I, which is, if we've studied any spiritual disciplines, that is the central question that lots of traditions sort of hold as the core. And yeah, so became someone very interested in that answer, between, what is this thing that sees? What is it seeing? What is the process of seeing? And then for me, it was also really central to integrate simplicity, because I found that in my own experience, beingness was really basic, and not basic as in rudimentary, but basic as in foundational.
Yeah, yeah, the beingness. Well, with you beginning to open yourself up to more of what is obviously possible in life, you stepped into a whole new environment. You moved out of that area, right? And where did you land?
Yeah, I mean, I went to college for 1 year at a state school in Wisconsin, and then I transferred to a private school in Wisconsin for my final 3 years. Then I lived for a short time in Madison, Wisconsin, for about, actually, first I moved to San Jose, California for 6 months, and then I moved back to where I had gone to finish my college and lived with a friend there. And then ended up in Madison, Wisconsin, and actually lived there for two-year stints at separate times, and sort of used the university just as a resource. I wasn't enrolled as a degree student, but took classes pretty full time for at least a year or two, and just as a learning process.
So, Jonathan, you have been on a journey to be authentic and to be aware and to know truth. And it feels like, the beginnings around reading a lot, and then the moments where you brought yourself back to a quiet time with yourself, and then that question, beginning to ask that question of folks like, who are you? And that question seems to be, it's still with you in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have my answer.
Yes,
And
yes.
and
Okay, before we go there, though, hey, folks, hold on, because we're going to get to what Jonathan and I are talking about today. And it is about truth, and it is about who we are essentially as beings. And I'm going to take just a quick break, and we'll be right back.
If you want to get started right away to find your voice, download Doreen's free 7-step guide to fearless speaking at doreen7steps.com.
Hi, we're back with Jonathan Reynolds, my friend and actually neighbor. And we are talking about today about Jonathan's journey to find himself and to find his voice, because a voice isn't just something that's hanging out in the air. It's really inside of you somewhere, and it's attached to what? To your thought? Are you speaking from a thought? Are you speaking from your heart? Are you speaking from your beingness? And I think that awareness and mindfulness plays a part in knowing, listening to yourself and knowing where words are coming from, because words are energy and words have meaning. And are we aware of what that's all about? So we're back now. Hi, Jonathan.
hi, great to be back.
Yes. So why don't you, now that we've journeying into the past and started to open up your future as somebody who's deep inquiry person. Uh, you laughed as right before break, and we talked about the idea of knowing who we are. Let's go there now. Unless there's something else about your history and voice that you might want to say about finding your voice.
I think there's a million things. I mean, one of the things that I studied at UW-Madison was metaphysics, which isn't the metaphysical element that maybe we find in New Age stores, but it's a philosophical branch that studies soul, self, soul, substance, and God. And so that was a big foundation for me, is how do we experience reality? Around voice, I just want to, I think it was Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, said something to the effect of, we can sort of measure our own growth by listening to the quality and tone of our own voice. And so that became a very central piece for me. And I fell in love with things like chanting and other things as modes of expression. And I consider most of my work to be as a translator of subtle experience. And of course, the way that we translate is via words and speaking and writing. And so that's part of the reason we're talking here, is it's so central to the work that you do, this personal growth piece.
Well, that phrase, a translator of subtle experience, is that?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I had to repeat that so it could resonate out into the world. So those of you who are listening today, make sure that you Google Jonathan Reynolds, and you'll be able to, you have a YouTube channel. There's just lots of ways that you can continue to listen to what Jonathan offers in terms of this sensitivity to life and who we are and how we experience ourselves in this world. Oh, I am so moved and touched by just listening to you. I think I could just not ask questions and just say, go, Jonathan, just down a path. And I
Careful
know
what
I'll
you
learn.
ask for.
But I'm going to ask you a few more questions just because it's so let's go back to this idea of, so you said that there was some studying that you were doing and you came up with this beautiful phrase about you and your role, how you see yourself as a translator of subtle experiences. Say more about that. Let's see what opens up when you consider that as one of your purposes for being here,
Hmm.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of the way we make meaning is based on how we articulate the experiences we have. And because on a world scale, English is a relatively new language, um, it has limitations. If any of us have studied other languages, we find that, some languages have like 30 words for taste, whereas English has something like 10 words for taste. And so I think, and when it comes to things psychological or experiential, we maybe even have less words. And so I think the capacity to articulate or give words also gives meaning and scaffolding to being able to digest subtle experiences. So experience is draped over concept in a certain metaphorical sense, but if we don't have the concepts or we don't have the subtle language, it's hard to sort of digest what happened. And so I think it's really helpful to have somebody that's been exploring for a while to help do that for us.
And where that takes me is in the listening. And there's a way to listen more deeply and without bringing agenda to a conversation, especially if we're listening to be able to really get what's happening for somebody in a more subtle way, and that's around their emotions or even just physical, what's going on, because you can say, hi, what's going on? And it's like, oh, I don't know what's going on. But for you being a listener, I think that's where the gift is, to listen deeply.
Hmm. Years ago, I had started a nonprofit called Learning to Listen.
Uh-huh.
And it was all about exactly what you're saying, is that capacity to listen both relationally, but also with that inner ear, with that inner listening.
Yes. Yeah. And then the hearing of what you've listened out of yourself, then there's the speaking of it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And then the hesitations that come up because of either what we've learned, like what you learned early on about, is it whatever you learned about being a man, let's say, that those are what constrictions, they are ways in which we hold back what we have listened to inside of ourselves, which is something about truth. And when we know how to listen to layers of truth, I guess it really is, because it is layers. It's not just one truth. Oh, let me ask, do you think there's just one truth?
I think that everybody's experience is true and they can be very different from each other. I think as experiential beings, we receive even objective reality through the filter of our experience. It's part of the reason why I love phenomenology, is I think that's where the answers lie for each person.
The answers lie
In relating to truth, there was a book years ago called Theories of Truth by Tarski, I believe is the author. I studied it in a philosophy class, and it addresses a lot of these issues around, is truth made by concept? Is truth made by social agreement? What is it? For me, it's subjective and phenomenological.
yes, definitely. For me, it feels subjective, and it's a sense, some kind of feeling, but that's part of how, when you, let's go back to that question, who are you?
Hmm.
Because I think that's where we are right now. So we had this great big smile about who are you? And you said, I think I found the answer. So let's go there. We've still got some time.
Yeah, yeah. First, I just want to touch a little bit on voice coming out of experience, because I think that's a really important component.
Mm.
And for me, like for instance, in this conversation, I'm not talking about my childhood. I'm talking from the experience of my childhood. And that's a really important distinction. I'm not sort of a scientist studying it from the outside and even remembering it as if there's some distant maybe connection to it. No, I'm touching into my body-based sensations around what it was for me and is in this moment, and then just verbalizing it. And so I think you can hear in somebody's voice whether they're talking about something and it's sort of this mind activity, or they're speaking from their experience, and then it feels much more authentic. And I know that's sort of the crux or core of your work to a certain extent, I'm sure. But that's such an important distinction, because if you're ever talking to somebody and your eyes sort of glaze over because you can't stay with them, they're probably not tapped into their authenticity. I like to say, why would anyone believe anything I'm saying unless I believe it? And the only way that I can believe it is if I'm connected to it, because otherwise it's me just talking to talk. Um,
Oh, I'm applauding. I just feel like, yes, 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 not a feeling. It's so true what you just said about the experience, and how it also relates to what you said about voice having a resonance when it's a voice is a felt experience as opposed to just words. And the words and then my question is, where are those words coming from? I think you
mhm.
just answered. If they're coming from a felt sense of an experience, of a truth of an experience, then there's way more um, realness to it, I guess is what we're saying.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, and I think it directly relates to the question around identity. Everybody identifies or creates their identity in various ways and on different levels as far as what serves. In this context, I'm the I'm the one being interviewed and you're the interviewer. And again, that's part of our identity in this context. And so there's conventional identities, and then there's essential or ultimate identities. And for me, the only ultimate identity is awareness. That ultimately is each of our identities. And part of what we do when we practice relating to awareness is we recognize that we don't actually create awareness. It's just something that's always there that we tap into. It's available and it's always present. And sometimes we mask it or confuse it or layer over too much conventional identity. Again, we all need conventional identity. We're in a physical world where we relate together and we have to get our work done and we have to be in relationship to others. But when that's connected to or informed or infused by our ultimate identity, which again, in my experience, has bared out as pure awareness, um, then it's everything we do is informed by that information or that relationship or that expression. Um, so, and again, I'm open to that changing or my definition changing if new direct experience reveals otherwise. I just haven't seen it in 3 decades of practice.
Oh, fabulous. I feel like I got my answer. Hey, folks, did you hear that? It was really fabulous to have Jonathan anchor in the sense of awareness being what is truth and how, I mean, it's just so layered, isn't it? The sense, but it's also so clear. Just absolute awareness is not anything other than here. And then we're talking about presence.
When I was studying truth in the early days of my philosophy studying, everyone seemed to think that truth was hard to find. And so everybody was looking for truth. And then I realized, oh, the reason nobody can find truth is because everything's true.
Uh-huh.
Everything's true in the degree and to the quality and in the way that it is true. And once you really sort of make that internal pivot, and it's not a cognitive pivot, but it's a felt sense embodied pivot, you're like, oh, I'm done looking for truth. Truth is everything. You can't see anything but truth. Now, the way that you interpret it or the way
Yeah.
that you digest it, and there's a science called the hermeneutics, which is a study of interpretation.
Mhm.
And that falls, I mean, part of my exposure to that came through study of Buddhism. And so how we actually make meaning from it or interpret it, then it determines whether it's going to be useful or helpful to our growth in some way that we want. But yeah, truth is everywhere. Truth is not hard to find.
Uh-huh.
Even if somebody's lying, well, the truth of what they're saying is they're lying.
Uh-huh.
There's
Uh,
there's there, there's a truth in that. I mean, on a conventional or superficial level, the stuff they're saying isn't valid. But that doesn't mean that there's not an embodied being truth about what's unfolding.
yeah. Uh-huh. In the moment and noticing. So we're coming to an end, and I want to make sure that people get a chance to find you and also open up these last few minutes to whatever seems to be arising at this point after our conversation here today. So, mindful life, mindful work dot, what was the,
Oh, mindfullifemindfulwork.com is our root website.
uh-huh,
Uh, maybe for your listenership, I would think that Mindset Social, our new mindful social media platform, which is mindset-social.com, might be a really good starting place if they want to integrate these sorts of sensibilities into their life and work. Um, and there's a million other places. We're on all social media, and yeah, find us and connect for those that are
well,
interested.
Mindset Social is a free networking place so that we gather and we have events, and you can also, there are books that people sell, and it's just a really fabulous growing network of people committed to mindful life and mindful work. So, Jonathan, here we are at our hmm, moment of coming to a close of this moment together. What comes through for final words that you are listening to?
What I've found most important is beginning. And what's hardest for folks is to begin a practice of self-awareness because we can be really hard on ourselves. And I think it's important for everyone to know that everyone who has practiced, no matter how long they've practiced, started. as a new beginner. And that, I've been meditating for a long time, but I like to say that for about the first 3 years, I pretended to meditate because that's how people start. Nobody knows what they're doing in the beginning. You think there's some value there. It's about running the experiment, being committed to the experiment, surrounding yourself with other people that are interested in it. And it can be really difficult, but when you step into the new way of being, there are others there that are kind and will want to support you on your practice path.
And it's beautiful, the step into a new way of being. I might just title our episode, Stepping into a New Way of Being. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Doreen.
Yes.
Thank you for being with us today for this episode of Find Your Voice, Change Your Life. Each person Doreen interviews shares what has helped them find their voice. You can learn from these guests and find your voice so you can be confident to speak up and speak out. And remember to download Doreen's free 7-step guide to fearless speaking at doreen7steps.com. We hope you enjoyed the show and will return next time. Until then, goodbye for now.